there was a phrase that I said that made me think, we need to talk about that more. How about that?
Yeah, that's how it usually happens. A lot of these episodes are just organic, kind of like that, right, Brian?
Yep. So let's call this the collaborative creative. Launch it onto the loop today as we discuss this on Curiosity Continuum.
Hey, everybody, this is Josh.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to the podcast for Curiosity Continuum.
Curiosity Continuum is an industry innovating, non-traditional company passionate about growing wisdom in the next generation.
We are the essential bridge between the analog and digital worlds by building collaborative communities that unleash the power of adaptive expertise and innovation needed to thrive in the 21st century.
We combine and mix essential elements needed to empower people to succeed in new ways, not possible outside of a creative, thoughtful, diverse community of fellow curious people.
Follow us in your favorite podcast app to receive notifications of new content. If you like what you hear and want to dive deeper, visit us at curiositycontinuum.com. Thanks for tuning in. Let's start the conversation.
So what we kind of talked about on another episode was the creatives who go in a dark hole for a long period of time and they come out with brilliance, right? But this is a collaborative creative, or even like a creative process, and you come up with a different result. They're both valuable. Josh and I fall into the collaborative creative because just how we riff off even one another in these conversations, something sparks something else. And even for those creatives who like to maybe do solo creation, they're still affected by how they grew up, by the person they saw at the grocery store, or, the funny thing their dog did the other day. Who knows? So they're collaborating, even if it's an active or passive collaboration with something or someone. You want to talk about that a little bit, Josh, about some of the ways that affects you?
Yeah, I'll just kind of start off by giving a couple more examples, too, that I've come up with. So some of these people collaborate that, like let's say you're creating like a script or something, that you're in a group of people. So you're like actually actively riffing on something that's supposed to happen. Like you might know where you want to go, but you might not know how you have to really get there. Another kind of group of people that actively collaborate and then solo collaborate really well are animators. Anybody doing any kind of artwork, because you could obviously do like an animation or something by yourself, but you're part of a bigger group. And so you're actually doing that together in that way. So you don't always have to be in the same room or even a Zoom call or whatever, but you do have to kind of collaborate left and right. Right, Brian?
Yep. So the practical example for me in my life is being a musician. I play bass, and bass players many times play with other people. And their contributions make the most sense in context to what everybody else is doing, because they're playing a specific role in that band. Now, there's a very famous bass player named Victor Wooten, and he's known in music circles very well, and even outside of music circles. He's definitely an innovator on the instrument. And he released an album, it's over 15 years ago now, they just had re-released a few years ago, called A Show of Hands. And this was Victor's basically playing bass solo pieces, but tapping and doing things to make it sound like he was doing more. But he wasn't really doing more. It was just him. And it was really innovative for bass players to listen to, especially because this really moved what you could do with the instrument forward and put it in a sense of people went, whoa, it could do that. Right? And it was a great thing. But then when you see him play with others, he collaborates differently. He had a band called the Wooten Brothers. Now, if you're in Nashville, you probably have heard of the Wooten Brothers. And they play wonderfully. And they've been a family band. And Victor was, playing bass at 5 years old. It was some ridiculous thing. He's a very talented guy. But that band does things that you could never do by yourself. And being in that musical environment, Victor, he said, he never really practiced. He just played. That was how he practiced. That's how he got good. And this is, nobody told him he couldn't do it. He just did it. To me, I need those checks and balances so I don't just go down this weird mental hole of this is the best idea, and it's really not. And Josh is very good to say, no, it's not a good idea, Brian. So.
Yeah, we do kind of riff on each other and work on each other's strengths and weaknesses. And I think that's what is important when you're collaboratively creating, or you're one of those people that need somebody like that, because you might not understand what's a good idea and what's a bad idea, because to you it sounds great because it's your idea. And you're like, oh, I'm just going to keep going on that. Instead of working 40 hours on that idea, Brian can say to me, hey, that sucks. Let's tweak this in a nice way. Let's tweak this, Josh. Okay.
Sometimes I'm not nice, but
But I mean, most of the times, like you don't have to be rude with people, but you have to say like, you know what, let's just tweak that because it's not going to work the way you think it's going to work. And once it's explained or once I see it, I'm like, you know what, you're absolutely right. This is not going to work.
So let's spin that in a different direction also. So
Yeah.
there's some inherent communication skills you have to have in order to communicate an idea. And everybody's on a continuum of whether it's, really good or really not, as far as their skills to share that idea. What's interesting is that idea is something that if you have a certain set of assumptions. Let me back up. You have a certain set of assumptions that you'll approach the idea with, and you'll come to the conclusion based on those set of assumptions. But when you put that out in space, especially if it's a picture, it's something, people are like, I don't get it. Because they have a different frame of reference they're bringing to it. And so it may not make sense for them. Now, sometimes you say, well, this is okay. It doesn't have to make sense to you. It needs to make sense for people like this or like me. That's fine. That's perfectly good.
Right.
But one thing Pixar did beautifully, especially in their earlier movies, was they made sure that the entire company understood the plot as it moved along. And if they didn't, whether you were in finance or you're in maintenance or whatever, if you did not understand the plot point or the emotion of the scene and it didn't work, the people went back and they reworked the scene so that everybody could move along. Now, that's what made Pixar really successful, especially in the early days, is they really tuned their story so that people could understand the idea. Now, it doesn't mean that you know all their histories and stuff. It does mean that the idea was clear enough for them to grasp and move along. That's something where it's a commercially viable film versus like an art film that two people really just they'll give their left arm for.
Right.
And there's usefulness to both. You have to ask yourself, what are you trying to create with this idea?
Yeah, and what are you trying to accomplish? Like, are you trying to make sure that everyone understands, or are you trying just to get a point across? And if you're trying to get a point across, everyone has to understand it. So I don't really think there's many artists out there that are like, oh, I don't care if half the people don't get it. From their frame of reference, they probably want that feedback. Now, Brian and I had the pleasure of talking to a couple of people that created a video game. And that's going to be on you might have heard that episode already, you might not have, depending on where this comes out. And I'm not going to say what it is just for that very reason. But they were prime examples of people who loved feedback. And like they took it they wanted the critical feedback. So he even said to us in the interview, he said, please tell me what you don't get. Please tell me where you struggled, because I want to make this easier for you to understand. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And that's what's really special about a lot of these creative endeavors, right, Brian?
Yeah. And, the feedback was is that, the users, how they use something, especially in a game, take it in a direction, they approach something that they never would have thought of, because, again, they developed it the way they knew how, but they didn't know what it would become. So some of that is you in a collaborative, creative environment, or in the spirit of somebody who's like that, is willing to not let any idea be the hill you die on always. Sometimes it's good to do that. But generally, people think like, well, if you compromise, that means that you're not at the result that you want. And sometimes that's true. But other times, you have compromised or you have given ground on something, and another idea enters the frame. And that synthesis together actually is a better result that you never would have come up with previously. Dumb example, but everybody knows it. You have chocolate and you have peanut butter. And they're both good in their own right. But you put them together and there's something magical that happens when you put those two things together. But
yeah, I don't know what it is, but it's like good.
It's real good.
Yeah.
So those type of things, like there's different elements that complement. Josh, I'm flashing back to like middle school science class where you talk about the elements.
Sure.
You talk about the compounds and stuff. Elements are really cool. And they have qualities and stuff, but those things together actually make a different result. And that's actually where you see a lot of it in the world. You might say, here's the building blocks of the world, but this is what we did with those building blocks. And oftentimes, one creative mind is a building block. When you put it together with other people, create, this entire other thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like, one word in a like one word of the dictionary, and then lots of words together make the dictionary, right? So it's just because you might come up with the one word doesn't mean you have the entire thing. And so remember, and we've talked about this before, when you're in these kind of like fields and you're actually doing a creative thing, it's very important to be able to take that criticism and meet people where they're at with it, and not like take it as a personal attack on yourself. Because a lot of people make something like that they create as like part of them, and they don't want anybody touching it. And that's where you have to kind of like take the emotional aspect of it, kind of tamp that down a little bit.
And what's crazy about it is that when you're a creative person, you pour yourself into that creation. So that's why sometimes, the creative people, they're sensitive. It's like, well, they poured themselves into something.
Yeah.
Which, Josh, this actually brings up another point around the collaborative creative and the spirit of what they do, is there's so many other skills that you have to hone and develop in order to collaborate well with others.
Yes.
It's all the soft skills that aren't necessarily core to being creative. It has everything to do, though, with how you relate to others. And I think that's maybe why the collaborative creative process is a better result often, is because you have to have all these other skills to communicate it. And in doing that, then you've built a bridge. That means that the idea itself has elements where people can get to your idea. You haven't made it so exclusive or esoteric that people can't.
Yeah. I mean, that is the core here, right? The core of this idea is to actually make sure that you have the other skills necessary to hone the collaboration part down. Because you would have to have the communication skills. You have to be able to have the critique, be able to take the critique and just be emotionally okay with it. Where, you can kind of irk you, and that's fine, but you have to kind of meet these people where they're at and kind of try to understand what they're saying. Maybe the spirit of what they're saying. Sometimes somebody will say something and not really understand it, and then so you say, "Oh, do you mean this?" And that's where these skills really come into play, right, Brian?
Yeah. So, what's the last thing you collaborated on or collaborated with somebody for a creative result? Yeah, I'm reminded of a gingerbread house contest I recently did, and unfortunately I lost. Josh and I have other stories about some art projects that we worked on together that were just not good in the end, but we had fun doing
the end result wasn't good, but we had fun.
Yes. So find something to collaborate on. It might be a puzzle. It might be a recipe. Sometimes you can think real high and mighty, like I have to have something high art to collaborate on. It could just be a recipe or cooking in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And
doesn't have to be complicated.
Exactly. Let's put a comma there, huh, Josh?
Yeah, let's do it.
Until next time, this is Brian.
And this is Josh.
For Curiosity Continuum.